Welcome. It's a pleasure having you here. My name is Paul Iagnocco, and I currently head up our customer enablement group, and I'm a senior privacy consultant here at TrustArc. I'm delighted to have with me Lindsay Palmer, and I'll let Lindsay go ahead and provide a brief introduction of herself.
Hi there, thanks, Paul. I'm a senior privacy research specialist at TrustArc, so I am on the research team, and my team is responsible for all of the content that generates a lot of our products, that a lot of our products are based off of. And so I have been with TrustArc for about 7 years. I was with Nimity before that.
So today, the agenda is, I think it's always really important when we're talking about a rather new subject on the horizon, that is provide kind of an overview of the artificial intelligence landscape. Then we'll move quickly into the various opportunities being brought forth by these various AI solutions. And then we're going to kind of shift into more of the focus on regulations as well as opportunities for us to, as privacy professionals, to kind of get in front of what we're now seeing with the artificial intelligence and particularly the artificial Bill of Rights. And then Lindsay will continue on with the governance aspect and particularly the focus on privacy rights. And then we'll talk about some immediate next steps, some operational things, some pragmatic steps, if you will, and then open it up to answering the various questions that came in through the chat. As always, the information provided during this webinar does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, all information, content, and materials presented during this webinar are for general information purposes only. So one of the things I wanted to just kind of bring to the forefront, many of you may have seen this or other items of this sort that were in the news because of its significance, and that is the Geoffrey Hinton, who we see here, who is officially viewed as the godfather of artificial intelligence, recently left Google last week. And he did that so that he can warn of the dangers ahead regarding, sadly, what he created. And I think the important thing to understand here is he needed to leave Google, but the most, so that he can clearly articulate some of those dangers without obviously impacting Google and Google's business in this AI space as it moves forward with BARD and other things. So the important thing, I think, that the key takeaway here is he has basically stepped away and is starting a number of lectures about basically the caution that needs to be put forward regarding artificial intelligence. We all hear about the great opportunities, but we also are beginning to learn of, in the hands of bad actors, what that could look like. And so Geoffrey, look forward to him continuing to discuss, not only things like ChatGPT, but also BARD and other open AI technologies, as well as artificial intelligence solutions out there. As with anything, right, when you get into a new area, a new space, it comes with its own set of information, for new subjects. There's a whole new suite of terms and definitions. Not as many acronyms as we often see in privacy. I'm sure those are yet to come. But I want to just kind of share with you a couple of key ones as we go forward. So applied AI obviously is anything that's really trying to solve a specific problem or task. The artificial intelligence is obviously trying to simulate, if you will, the human intelligence in these machines, and we'll talk about the different stages of artificial intelligence in just a moment. Automated systems, think about those as having minimal or no human intervention as they produce outcomes, decisions, observations. The generative AI is basically focusing on the ability to generate new content such as imagery, videos, and text. The large language models, and you'll hear about those all the time. You may not hear about them as large language models, but obviously the chat GPT solution, Bard, the solutions with Bing and Microsoft, all those are large language models and what we call deep learning algorithms that essentially generate self-supervised learning and predict and generate text. So those are the key things. It's very much a text-based model. The natural language processing helps. It's focusing on the computers as it learns to interpret, manipulate, and comprehend the human language. And then regenerative AI is an area that certainly hasn't been totally cracked yet, and that is helping intelligent systems, these large models, adapt and regenerate and or repair themselves. And what I mean by that is, think for a moment that it can learn on its own through the manipulation, or not the manipulation, excuse me, through the intelligence it is gathered and what it did. And it acts very much like a human and identifying and changing behaviors so that it, shall I say it, has a level of consciousness, if you will, of the human being. So as I mentioned, this next slide is about really focusing in on the evolution of data and particularly cross-referencing it with the web. I thought this was a particularly interesting piece to kind of look at. So on the left-hand side, you see obviously these various stages of evolution of the data. On the right side, you see how that aligns with the growth and development of the web as we know it today. So you see at the very base of this pyramid, you see the early transactions back in, starting in 1995, right? And having basically content that is consumed by the consumer, right? It's transaction based. And as you see over in Web 1.0 there on the right side, right, we're talking about e-commerce, basic web pages, basic HTML, e-commerce, JavaScript is in this time period. We obviously move very quickly with the advent of, and particularly social media, into the next stage, if you will. And that stage started as business intelligence. And when you look at the ETL, by the way, that means extract, transform, and load. When you look at that data, that warehousing, a lot of that information was used to create reports, right? And once we navigated through that and had these custom reports being generated through this business intelligence and learning, we then moved into the next kind of later phase of Web 1.0, which got into machine learning. So what is that? Well, it's maybe things that you have at home. So any of those home devices, those home assistants that we're seeing that's created the proliferation, obviously, of the Internet of Things, any of those devices that can aid us and help us that are obviously induced by the user to create a response. Quite repetitive, we know that, but obviously a step, if you will, in this great evolution of data. Web 2.0, of course, social media. This is where you and I, as users of the web, are creating content, posting content, and so forth. A lot of mobile access here and a lot of need for high-speed communications. So that's Web 2.0. as well as the evolution of data. The very last piece of this, and we can debate whether or not where we are in this first line of machine intelligence. You talk to a number of those that are in this particular space, and you will find out some say we just tripped over that line, some say no, we're about midpoint, some say we're further than that. It's not an area where everyone is in alignment, and you'll find that as you get more and more up into these machine intelligence and consciousness phases, if you will, that people have a wide variety of where we stand. But for our purposes, I'm just going to put it somewhere in the middle of machine intelligence. But the important thing here is, how did we get here? We're looking at Web 3.0. This is now where virtual reality, augmented reality, or the metaverse kind of comes in. Blockchain technology, particularly in the financial services area, is very prominent and getting more prominent by the day. Obviously, artificial intelligence comes out of this particular space, as well as the interoperability and NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. So, which kind of work in conjunction with the blockchain development. So, the very last phase, the machine consciousness. If you read about what the godfather of AI says, he thinks that machine consciousness is closer than we think, while others that I have read state, 2045. I've seen one state 2200, the year 2200. So it really varies, again, where and who you kind of talk with and where we are in these various stages. But understand that when we talk about machine consciousness, what we are focusing in on here is that the machine actually begins to appear, is from an intelligence standpoint, to be smarter than the human being. The consciousness part is probably the big area of trying to understand, what does that mean? Think of it as, if those of you are familiar with Star Trek Next Generation, this is Data and his emotional chip embedded in him. And it's the emotions, right, that are kind of key to this consciousness. I get asked this all the time, when will the machine have that consciousness and have the ability to feel emotion? That's the great myth, as well as a great disparity of thought in when that's going to occur. We're not there yet. We're certainly, there's folks that are certainly working towards that. And as you can imagine, with any of this stuff, there's always that positive side, right, in the hands of good actors. And then there's that negative side, the hands of bad actors, that we have to contend with. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I wanted to kind of break down further artificial intelligence so that we could get a little bit more granular. So on the far left side, the machine learning stage, again, it talks about specializing in this particular area. A lot of home devices are in this particular space, like Alexa. Obviously, mobile devices, that are playing out in this space. The next stage, stage 2, which we talked about moments ago, again, is smart as a human across the board. And you may be going, we have not got to that point, have we? Well, the question I think we have to ask is exactly what is that point? I mean, we certainly have seen Deep Blue back in 1997. I know I'm probably dating myself, but 1997, if those remember that a chess master, Garry Kasparov, was basically beaten by an intelligent machine at that moment in time in the game of chess, and he being the world's greatest chess player at that moment. completely stunned the world that a machine obviously beat a human being in this case. So we do see that in certain stages of evolution, in certain degrees of use within the technology today. But that third stage, as we say to the right, is the ultimate goal for many, and that is how do we create a machine that is good across multiple things and develops a consciousness in itself. So in this particular slide that I adapted from McKinsey and Company, who has a whole list of things, I just grabbed a couple of snippets here just so that we could talk a little bit about, lack of better term, somewhat the positives or the opportunities for generative AI. Now, you may look at some of these and go, well, I don't view that as a positive thing. I see that as, taking away of jobs. And certainly we have heard, particularly over the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a preponderance of discussion regarding job losses. The writers, I forget, the Writers Guild in Hollywood obviously is picketing right now. And one of the issues that they're picketing about is having control over AI in the drafting, the writing of scripts, the animation part that can be done through some of this AI technology and so forth, and the potential job loss. So while the contracts are obviously talking about normal contract stuff, AI is also a part of that discussion. So it's very much front and center for us today in what we're doing. So as you see here, simple things like drafting under text, simple things like drafting interview questions, job descriptors. And by the way, if you have not played with chat, the chat GPT or Bard or some of the other technologies out there, I encourage you to go to those and try them out to really understand what they can and cannot do. It was eye-opening for me, as I think I would state it, when I first asked it a series of questions. I'm diabetic. I asked it to create a meal plan for me for a full week, a diabetic meal plan, and it did it within 15 seconds, which was pretty startling. Or ask it something like, tell me about all the top level details, or tell me about, give me a summary of the AI Bill of Rights, and it will calculate it for you within seconds. So it's pretty amazing in how it could take all this disparate data that has been obviously poured into these big models and generate some large scale content. But with anything of this sort, all these opportunities, all these quote unquote positive things, there's a downside of all of this stuff, right? In the hands of bad actors who wish us harm, they want us to be misinformed, and social scoring or discrimination, all of those things can come about in the hands of those bad actors. And as penned last week by the FTC chair, Lena Khan, she basically said that in her op-ed in May 3rd in New York Times, that enforcers and regulators must be vigilant. And perhaps, it's almost like, can we pump the brakes so just a tad here so that we can get in order and be able to, and ready to address these various bad actors. And with that, going forward, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, the resident expert in this area for TrustArc. Lindsay will take it from here.
Basically, what is known as the AI Bill of Rights is actually a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So this was established by the White House to help guide the design and use of AI. It's a non-binding and non-enforceable, so it doesn't have any legislative protections as of yet as a blueprint. Specifically, the Bill of Rights applies to automated systems that have the potential to meaningfully impact people's rights and opportunities, and also their ability to access critical resources or services. So the Bill of Rights consists of a set of 5 principles, and with those 5 principles are a long list of associated practices, and these are meant to guide organizations through the effective development and implementation of AI systems, with particular emphasis on unintended consequences of civil and human rights abuses. So the associated practices, as I said, that are tied into these principles, they provide a fairly comprehensive and detailed outlook on what is to be expected. And so none of the guidance, I'm going to call the associated practices, they are kind of like guidance. I'm going to say that it should not be particularly novel to anyone who's already familiar with working with or developing or deploying IoT devices. It does have a very similar tone. So we'll get into this. So under the safe and effective principle, there is a consultation element where you should be developing your system in consultation with diverse communities, stakeholders, and domain experts. There's also a risk assessment element. So this is where the system should undergo pre-deployment testing, risk identification and mitigation, and ongoing monitoring that demonstrates that the system is actually safe and effective. So this too is not novel. There's many jurisdictions that require a privacy impact assessment to be conducted for any high risk processing, including where new technologies are being used. So that kind of ties into there. To accompany this, there should also be an independent evaluation and confirmation that the system is safe and effective. And then these results of this reporting, this independent evaluation and confirmation, should be made public whenever possible. You also have to design systems in a way that protects people from algorithmic discrimination, as Paul mentioned earlier. So protections should include proactive equity assessments as part of the system design. So this is where you'd want to do things like gate checks at each phase of the design to confirm that your algorithm in no way discriminates against a certain group of individuals. If your system is using data that is representative of a certain community of people, you want to continuously review this for bias and historical and social context. And you should also be ensuring that there is no accessibility issues for people with disabilities. So that's all been baked right into the AI Bill of Rights. You also want to make sure that your automated systems have built-in privacy protections by default. So think of like data minimization and using the data in a way that aligns with people's reasonable expectations. Collection, use, and disclosure of personal information that's related to your automated decisions should be based on consent, which should be specific for narrow uses of the data and for specifically set timeframes. So systems should not be designed to remove or bypass user choice. And default settings should be privacy friendly. Again, we've seen this in IoT before. Any type of surveillance technologies should be subject to heightened oversight and should include, at a minimum, a pre-deployment assessment of potential harms. Individuals should also be able to access their personal information and their metadata about themselves and know who has access to their data. They should be able to correct it as well. And then there should be mechanisms in place to delete data and metadata when consent is withdrawn. With regard to transparency, people should know that an automated system is being used and understand how outcomes and decisions impact them. We've seen this in recent FTC blogs. Information should be accessible and provided in plain language documentation with tailored explanations provided to specific audiences. So think of the type of audience you're trying to talk to, whether it's a developer or an end user, the general public, and basically you should be tailoring your explanation so that those audiences can understand it. Again, we see this in just general privacy where the regulators want you to make sure that your privacy notices are tailored specifically to your audiences. And finally, organizations should have in place human alternatives. So what this means is that individuals should be able to opt out of automated systems in favor of a human alternative. So this is where they can have access to an actual person who can quickly intervene, and a person who's trained to be able to complete the processing manually or remedy any problems with the automated system. The blueprint also recommends that human intervention or human consideration be incorporated for any adverse or high-risk decisions. And they also recommend that timely human-driven processes already be in place when the automated system is deployed, so that you're not deploying a system and then all of a sudden you have somebody who wants human intervention, or there is a call for that, and you're quickly trying to scramble and put some sort of human entity or person in place in order to address that. It should be kind of in tandem at deployment. So those are just a few of the key takeaways from the blueprint. It is quite prescriptive, and it's, I'm going to call guidance, the associated practices, but those are that's the gist of it. So as you can gather from the tone, the intent appears to provide a somewhat prescriptive roadmap for the development and deployment of AI in the US that is not legislatively restrictive, and that continues to promote and allow for innovative growth in AI. So we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so where does the AI Bill of Rights fit in here? So as you can see, it's just one piece of a broader AI landscape forming. So to further inform organizations' AI activities, in January of this year, NIST published its AI risk management framework. So this is a voluntary framework to help organizations incorporate trustworthiness into the design, development, use, and evaluation of their AI systems. It's very detailed. We have been studying it for quite some time, since January, going through it, annotating it, things like that. It's a very great starting point for anyone who just needs a starting point and some direction. Also, under its AI and Algorithmic Fairness Initiative, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission continues to provide resources for employers that use AI and machine learning in their hiring practices and any of their employment decisions. Globally, we have the OECD AI principles. So these principles focus on values such as transparency and explainability, fairness and accountability, and this is to promote the use of AI in an innovative and trustworthy way. There's also the Global Partnership on AI, which currently consists of 29 global members. This includes the US, EU, UK, Australia, Japan, among others. So this initiative brings together multiple stakeholders from government, science, industry, and academia. And their goal is to essentially share research and facilitate international collaboration on AI, basically to bridge the gap between AI theory and the practice of AI. And then to date, we've tracked 60 plus countries that have in place a national AI strategy. In the EU, so this is where we get a bit more legislative. So we have the EU AI Act, that's looming on the horizon. It's still currently in draft form. It's being discussed by Parliament. Once this is passed, there's an expected 2-year grace period to allow impacted companies to comply. So this act will classify different AI tools according to their perceived level of risk. So right now it's low, high, unacceptable. It will apply to anyone who provides a product or service that uses AI in the EU, including systems that generate an output such as any content, predictions, recommendations, or decisions. So there's still discussions happening on how the act will impact general AI systems. So this would include generative AI models like ChatGPT, and whether such systems will be designated as high risk. So from a privacy perspective, the EU AI Act will work in tandem with the GDPR. So any processing of personal data within these AI systems will still need to meet the requirements, excuse me, of the GDPR. And finally, the EDPB has opened a chat GPT task force meant to foster cooperation. And this will allow the exchange of information between data protection authorities on possible enforcement actions. So this was, I'm sure a lot of you have read the Italian DPA when they launched their investigation into chat GPT. And then kind of like dominoes, we had the German DPA and also the Spanish AEPD kind of follow suit in that they were raising concerns and talking about starting their own investigations. So this is kind of what spawned this EDPB chat GPT task force. So we'll see what happens with that. And I'll talk about that a bit later. So in that regard, let's take a look at some of the main challenges of AI solutions on the next slide, please. Okay, so transparency and explainability, it's going to be the theme throughout and forever with AI. So it's not a new challenge in the privacy context. Transparency and explainability of any complex processing has always been challenging, but it is exacerbated when dealing with like complex technical processing systems. So traditional challenges have been around understanding data sources that feed into a model and then explaining technical complexities of how a model processes the data to achieve its outputs. So if you think of a black box AI, so black box AI is an AI system whose the inputs and the operations are not visible to the user or other parties. So the system actually arrives at its conclusions or decisions without providing any explanations as to how they were reached. Generally, this is because the algorithm is processing so many data points that it's just too complex or difficult for humans to understand. And so the implications of these black box AI systems is that they can introduce bias into the system's algorithms, but because they lack transparency of what is taking place within the black box, bias processing may occur sometimes subtly. And then if that goes on for long enough, it can put organizations at risk of reputational damage or potentially even being subject to legal actions for discrimination. Another implication from a lack of transparency from a black box is that it's difficult for these black box systems to be properly audited because there's such a lack of understanding of how the processing operates. Again, transparency and openness is also challenged where stakeholder consultations do not take place. So as I mentioned, the AI Bill of Rights calls for consultation with stakeholders, including data subjects impacted by the processing done by automated systems. Yet we know in reality that consultation with data subjects or the public is a challenge. We can draw a comparison to the Article 35 of the GDPR. So Article 35 calls on controllers to seek the views of data subjects on the intended processing as part of the process when they're conducting a data protection impact assessment. So the law says that this should be done where appropriate, yet we don't see many examples of this being done. So a lot of organizations feel like they don't have the time to do this as they rush to get a product or process out the door, or they don't know how to do it while protecting commercial and proprietary interests of the business. So where some businesses are rushing to get their AI solutions up and running as quickly as possible, they might be, in a market where that's all what their competitors are doing as well. So let's rush to get this out as well to stay competitive. It will be very interesting to see whether these stakeholder consultations actually take place. And if they do take place, in what form, for instance, like how long will the consultation be? Who does it actually include? Is there going to be openness about that consultation is actually taking place? Or is it going to be something that people will try to more check a box of? So it will be quite interesting. We don't have a ton of examples of it yet. So that's still a bit unknown. The AI Bill of Rights also states that individuals should be able to access personal information and metadata about themselves and be able to correct it and have that data deleted when consent is withdrawn. So this is challenging because the ability of individuals to exercise their rights starts with transparency, but they must first be informed sufficiently enough about the processing of their data to then know that they can exercise their rights. So another issue is that in order for individuals to gain access to their data, the data has to be easily accessible by the business, and considerations have to be made about how or whether an automated system will be impacted when data is deleted. So this is where having a complete inventory of your data will come in handy. So you can include data flows as well to accompany your inventory, so you'll be able to quickly determine what data you have, where it is, what's happening to it at the different stages of processing. For bias and discrimination, there's just so much about it right now. So
Yeah.
so basically, this is where the training data includes some sort of bias, and then it just is perpetuated through the AI. So these existing inequalities and discrimination just get perpetuated as the AI system is used. We've seen the most examples of this bias and discrimination in AI models used for recruitment purposes. There is an example of Amazon a few years ago where this was a big issue, where the training data for the model relies on historical data that is often skewed to recognize a very specific type of candidate. And most of the cases, it's going to be a white male candidate. So there's going to be discrimination issues there. And then data abuse practices. This refers to the potential for misuse by bad actors. Paul's already mentioned this. So getting into that deep fake conversation. So we've seen the news about it. There's growing concern about it for sure, about the use of AI to create these convincing deep fake images and videos with the intent to spread misinformation, manipulate public opinion. So while those are obviously massive concerns that we all share as members of society, the challenge for businesses will be where similar types of AI technology are used to create highly sophisticated social engineering schemes. So think of phishing attacks. And then this will be much more easy to trick employees and make businesses more vulnerable to downstream cybersecurity attacks. So let's move on to the next slide, where we can look at some things that we can do to prepare for this. So I can't recommend enough that in this stage of the game anyway, to stick to the basics when it comes to processing personal data. So that is your privacy principles. The AI Bill of Rights and other AI frameworks are based on privacy principles that you're already familiar with. So there's transparency, security, data minimization, purpose limitation, retention. The AI Bill of Rights talks about these. So far, we've seen that regulators aren't really trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to regulating AI. We're seeing that they will continue to govern in accordance with existing data protection rules. So you might have seen a joint statement in the past few weeks. The FTC, Department of Justice, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, they've all publicly confirmed that their enforcement of federal law applies to automated systems the same as it applies to other practices. So what this means, let's say if we take the FTC as an example, is that the FTC will use the existing FTC Act when determining whether an AI practice constitutes an unfair or deceptive act. So in its own AI guidelines that it put out, the FTC has simplified this by essentially explaining that if your AI solution does more harm than good, such as if it could cause substantial injury to consumers that consumers cannot reasonably avoid, then the FTC can challenge the use of the AI solution as an unfair at practice under the FTC Act. Another example, as I mentioned earlier, is the Italian DPA's recent investigation of ChatGPT. So the Italian DPA had actually issued a temporary ban on ChatGPT, citing privacy concerns. So there was a lack of any legal basis that justified the massive collection and storage of the personal data that was used to train the model, concern about the failure to verify the age of users to ensure that they were 13 or older, inaccuracies in the tools processing of personal data for purposes of training the underlying algorithms, a lack of transparency about the processing of personal data to users whose personal data is collected by the tool. So ChatGPT was able to address some of these concerns, and it was later reactivated in Italy. But the point is that the Italian DPA wasn't using any, secret set of AI guidelines or secret set of AI legislative rule. They were relying on the GDPR privacy principles to conduct its investigation. So again, sticking to those privacy principles, that's where we are right now. You also want to scope out your processing. So I think another shift in thinking is when it comes to the use of AI solutions is that more focus needs to be on the scope of processing. So We often start with a solution. So, oh, we want to do this. And then we jam all of our processing activities into place to accommodate that solution. So a common example is where we have all of this data that we collected, what can we do with it? So rather than finding ways to use that data, the shift needs to take place where we instead start with what is the problem we're trying to solve? So what is the business trying to do? And then from that simple problem statement, you can build your solution through processes and technology in a way that makes it easier to apply your privacy principles to each step of your design, and then that gets you closer to your ultimate solution. There should also be a top level person that's responsible for AI governance in the organization. So essentially someone who's ultimately accountable for operational decisions that the business makes with regard to the use of the AI. So this position would work in tandem with an AI and data ethics committee, where the ethics committee should be made up of a diverse group of people from all over the organization and from all levels. So it should not just be a committee of other executives or a committee of people headed by the executive that's responsible for AI. So you want to start with top level accountability where you do have that top level executive, and then through your data ethics committee, you can have both top down and bottom up. So if you have people from all levels of the business involved in this advisory AI ethics group, then you can kind of have all your bases covered. And then finally, you want to create a culture where your AI undergoes extensive testing before deployment. So this is a cornerstone of the AI Bill of Rights. It's repeatedly mentioned in the practical steps for implementation. So if you were to go through all of those associated practices, you would see testing and reporting a lot. So the testing should include both testing of the specific automated system and of the manual processing that's done by human interveners and reviewers. And then in tandem with repeated testing, you want to be able to provide regular updated reports on how the system works and then the controls in place to mitigate those harms. So if we go to the next slide, and so just in the interest of time, I will talk briefly about privacy by design, and then Paul, you and I can get into it a bit more on our next slide. So I just want to call out the importance of privacy by, so I did mention it earlier when we were talking about scoping out your processing. Basically, the idea of privacy by design is that privacy cannot be achieved solely by complying with regulatory frameworks. So you can't just have a compliance checklist, check those boxes and say, great, we've got privacy by design. It instead needs to become the organization's mode of operation. So essentially, you want privacy safeguards to be organically integrated into the organization, into the operational phases as you build your automated systems and your AI models, rather than grafted on after the model is built. So I said, like, rather than before, like jamming your stuff into place afterwards, you want to be baking it in along the way. And you also don't want to be just addressing it after you've had a data breach or after you've had some sort of enforcement action. So Paul, I'll turn it to you. We'll get into some more practical steps, some more operational steps, and then we can revisit privacy by design if needed.
Thanks, Lindsay. Appreciate that. A very thorough discussion on where we are today and kind of the toolbox that we have, obviously, to address a lot of these things. In particularly looking at, obviously, privacy by design, as you have stated a number of times. Right now, from a regulatory standpoint, most of the leadership in this space, the knowledge experts, are seeing that the tools that we have today, that how we're addressing privacy today, for the most part, can mesh very nicely and serve as a basis for obviously determining next steps and operational moves at this moment in time. Obviously, as we move into that next stage of consciousness, right? All this, or even as we continue to expand out in the machine intelligence phase, we may have to, obviously, as an industry, as a vertical, have to revisit whether or not we do indeed have the tools necessary to deal with. And one of those is obviously looking at a lot of these different things. But these immediate next steps, when we put these together, was, I was thinking back in my days when I was the Chief Privacy Officer for the Kellogg Company, and thought about the importance of setting up guiding principles from the get-go. And I think AI warrants that today, so that we don't have to consistently repeat ourselves as privacy officials or security officials or whatever it may be. We need to put some guardrails out there, and then where our company, our business, our enterprise, whatever it is, can really operate and agree to, in principle, operate. And that really needs to be sold, and accountabilities need to be established, and sponsorships and so forth by the C-suite or current or select folks in the C-suite. I'm not a big fan of top-down, as I mentioned before. However, in this particular case, I think it would warrant that everyone take a look at developing some guiding principles on privacy and AI as part of that. The other thing that, Lindsay, you mentioned very emphatically is the whole black box piece. It's not one of those things that we're going to readily be able to see and understand what's in front of us. You're not going to be able to look at a web page. You're not going to be able to look at, something maybe in the recruitment phase of a candidate or a particular mobile app or whatever. Without understanding, you won't have a clear understanding that there's AI technology being used, right? You're just using the user interface, and it is leading you to steps and computes something at the very end. You don't have a clue really how that's manifested. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges we will have in the privacy industry is we already struggle a lot of times of being aware of everything that's going on in our organizations. This is yet one more complex area that we add to the flow. So where I'm going here is, in order for us to have this open conversation, for the privacy profession to be able to help our internal employees and outreach to our customers or consumers, we need to share what is going on. And that sharing has to be with the privacy folks as well as some other key people in security and so forth. And so I really recommend that there becomes some sort of workflow that things get reviewed early on as Privacy by Design discusses and articulates. Someone at the very beginning of the build out of an AI solution has to be there representing privacy and individual human rights. And so that's what this workflow is. The next thing is, many of you may already have some AI stuff moving forward. I recommend that you do some level of inventory at this particular stage, and obviously particularly looking at it with a future lens. What is the realm of possibilities? Then we can balance that with our principles to determine next steps. Assess, obviously, as Lindsay had mentioned, we already have these tools. So after we do an inventory, let's test it. Let's assess it and determine whether that service or widget, product or whatever it may be, has indeed privacy or data security gaps. Are we creating the necessary transparency? How are we going to address individual rights in this circumstance? How are we dealing with the security aspect, and so forth and so on those privacy principles? And then the last phase of this, because this area is rapidly changing so quickly, we need ongoing training, right? And particularly focusing on those roles, like now all of a sudden you may have to be talking to developers or training developers on how they should be approaching if they are advancing some level of AI. in the future of, what is being responsible in the development and expectations of AI with the public. So those are just kind of my brain dump, if you will, on the top of my head, but I think it flows very nicely back to what we can do immediately. Any questions? Oh, I see we got some few questions out there. So one of them comes in, and Lindsay, this is to you and I. Given the data black box, how is that expected to be balanced with data subject rights to edit or delete data for created content, whether it's picture or text-based on those people? It's nothing like starting off with a softball. To address, you have any preliminary thoughts on this one, Lindsay?
Not that I've seen in my research. This is similar to, we've seen when blockchain was first starting up, we saw very similar concerns and questions. So it wasn't until over time that more people were using it, and then the guidance was coming out on what you should do, shouldn't do, that people who operated blockchain were able to start to even look at how to address that. So for black box, because it is a black box right now, I don't have any answers. I know it's something that research is ongoing for right now, so it's just something we're going to have to continue to keep our eye on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Lindsay. From my research, I'm not seeing, other than obviously the urgency of the discussion on that particular area. And based on, similar to what I just said moments ago, right, there's this unknown. You don't know that it's being leveraged or used. And then if you don't even know it's being leveraged or used, how can you kind of respond to that, right? So there needs to be a way this gets escalated, right, that it is indeed being used. And more importantly, how are we going to limit these huge data warehouses where we're, beginning to look at, obviously, those data subject rights? And can they remove their information from that or not, right? Or is there, a way that somehow they can opt out of that content being used for these purposes? It just has not been fleshed out. A lot of discussion, but to my knowledge, nothing really concrete, just because it's not a common approach. Excuse me, it's not. Everything is not facilitated in the same way, right? These models are all different. They all are packing an enormous amount of information, and how to limit that is becoming frankly, one of the biggest issues that AI is going to have to contend with. So great question. There are a couple other questions here that I'm seeing. They're all dealing with some level of training. For those individuals that have kind of put that out, Ariel, if I can ask you to kind of take down these questions and the information from these folks so that we can respond back. The bottom line is, is there good training out there and so forth? There is emerging some good training out there. I would like to kind of spend time with Lindsay and a couple other folks in our team, kind of reviewing those and making a recommendation out there. There are few. Everyone's kind of taking a little bit of a different angle. A lot of them are talking about frameworks, and then some are, looking at, how do we educate our internal employees on these things. So for those that have posed those questions, we'll certainly get back to you. And with that, Lindsay, if you're looking for some solutions, TrustArc is certainly has solutions to address this. We're quickly ramping up and trying to get a better handle on what are those tools that you need going forward to help you navigate this new horizon? So with that, we wish everyone a great day, and thank you. And thank you, Lindsay, for your expertise